Good morning. I am still blown away by how much talent and passion we have in our student body. We have an incredible worship team, so you can give them another hand because they're ridiculous. Okay, we got a new elephant. What do you think? It's kind of pretty this week, right? No. I want to thank the Art Society, because they are the ones, again, more of your incredibly talented friends who have been working on these. You all may be seated. I actually don't do this a lot, so I actually forgot to tell the freshman and sophomore to sit down, and it was hilarious. They were standing there for I don't know how long, but you guys can be seated. I'm getting better at this. But I wanted to thank the Art Society with Angelina Ispier and the right there, thank you, and a lot of other talented people who are painting these elephants, and these elephants are sort of getting a reputation. Have you heard some of the sayings and some of the memes? Okay, I got one this morning. This apparently had leaked, and they had seen this, and they called it the mastodon of marijuana. Had you all heard that one yet? It was like, is this the drug talk? And I'm like, no, we're still talking about sex, okay? But here's my thing. This is a beautiful rendition. If you think that there's marijuana on here, you obviously don't know what marijuana looks like. And that is exactly what this chapel is about. We get so many crazy messages around sex that if we don't take time to really look at how God intended it to be, and we really don't go back and search through the Word and the Spirit and wise counsel, we don't know what it's really supposed to look like. And if we don't know what it looks like, then we can't see the counterfeits and we don't understand them. And so one of the things that we did last week was we talked about some of the different stories that our sexuality comes to us in. And it comes in different narratives. And we've asked you to think about sexuality. And what are those stories? We talked about the cultural narrative that's based around sort of expressing our own freedoms and defining our own purpose and meanings. And is that really the true story? Well, if we don't know what the true story is, then we don't know if it is or not. We asked you to think about, do your messages come wrapped in shame or in judgment? And is that really how sexuality is supposed to be and how we're supposed to experience it? Because again, if we don't know what God intended for sexuality or his purposes for it, we can't recognize the counterfeit. Federal agents are actually trained this way. They're trained. Who's seen the movie Catch Me If You Can? Has anybody seen that? It's a great movie, isn't it? Okay, if you haven't seen it, that can be your Netflix thing this weekend. But Catch Me If You Can is based on a true story, and Leonardo DiCaprio plays the main character, but it's based on a true story of a guy who was so good at forgeries that when they finally caught him, the FBI agents came to him and said, would you please teach us how to spot forgeries, how to spot the counterfeits? And he said, well, I'm not going to teach you how to spot the counterfeits. We're going to actually study the real thing, and we're going to know it so well that at any counterfeit that comes at you, you'll know it because it doesn't look like the real thing. And this is what today's chapel is all about. We're going to ask you to come with us and explore what God really intended for sexuality. We're going to develop a theology. Theos means God, and the ology means like logos or the word. So we're going to look at what our sexuality really should be so that when we see the counterfeits, we'll recognize them. And so I have some really good friends and some people that you really know are wise and respect. I have Pastor Mike, Pastor Bill Schott, and of course the beautiful and wonderful and wise Mrs. Mack to come and join me today. And we are going to explore these topics about sexuality from God's perspective. And again, we're doing this so that not to give you a list of do's and don'ts and yes and no's and rights and wrongs. We're doing this so you guys will understand how to think about sexuality. And when someone proposes something to you, you'll be able to look at it. Pastor Mike, can you pull Miss Mac's chair around a little bit? This is supposed to be like a living room. I'm going to be a little cozier here. Thank you. So when you think about sexuality, you know how to think rightly about it. And when something's presented to you, you go, wait, that doesn't match up. So we're going to take, you took my seat there. That's good. We got it. All right, we can move furniture. Oops. Okay, so I'm going to let Pastor Bill start. Pastor Schott. Both of them start. And he is sort of our resident pastor and theologian, and many of you guys have had him for apologetics. And he is going to take us all the way back to what the elephant represents, back to the garden, and back to the beginning. And then we're going to kind of go from there. So I'm asking you to engage and get your hearts and minds wrapped around this.
Good morning. Okay, all right. So as we go back to the garden and consider the origins of things, it helps to establish categories of understanding, so that when you are talking about a certain thing, if you have a category established and you can put that thing into the category of understanding, you bring more meaning to the thing that you're talking about. So as we talk about sex, and we go back to the beginning and we see the category that's been created for it, I just want to share some theological ideas and thoughts that have given me my categories of understanding that makes this topic sacred and beautiful and wonderful and deeper than anything the world's going to tell you. So my part this morning is simply to bring us back to the garden, give us this theological look. So as we begin, one of the narratives that you guys are hearing that's a false narrative that is so important in this conversation is the narrative of gender. And as there's argument over gender for the first time, I think, in world history, I want you to hear from God on this, and I want you to see from Genesis chapter 1 that, and this really comes forth in Hebrew, which you juniors are invited to take next year and study Hebrew with me, is when you read the Hebrew of Genesis 1, it's very rhythmic, it's very poetic, and it's clear that a pattern's being established in Genesis 1, and where there's a pattern, there's always a pattern maker, as you've heard me say in apologetics. So what we see is this, that when we get the 6 days of creation, there's things being celebrated constantly, and those things that are being celebrated are presented to us in pairs or in binaries, day by day by day. In day 1, we see God creates the heavens and the earth. And with the heavens and the earth, he creates from the darkness, he creates light. So we have this binary of heaven and earth and this binary of light and darkness. The second day, we get the waters being separated above from below. So we get this binary of waters upward and downward. And we also get, on day 3, we get the waters separated from the dry land. So now we have land and water. And we also get plants and trees. And those are celebrated in those pairs. On the 4th day, we get the 2 great lights to govern the day and the night. We get the sun and the moon as our binary of day 4. Day 5's binary, you get the sea creatures are created along with the winged creatures. They're given in a pair, the animals that fly and the animals that swim. And you're also given the beasts and the cattle. And you would think, well, that's really the same thing, beasts and cattle. But the Bible distinguishes between beast and cattle. Whenever you hear the beast mentioned, you'll also hear the cattle mentioned, except for one time. And that's right after the flood, when God says, I now put the fear of man in all the beasts. It's the only time cattle's not mentioned. And isn't it interesting that you don't see the fear of man in cattle? You never walk up to a cattle and he jumps and goes, oh my gosh, it's a person, right? In fact, cow tipping is a very popular sport in Davie, I believe, or Cooper City, where, because the cows don't run, you can actually tip them over. And that's where we get our ground beef from. Now, thank you, Declan. Yes, that was funny. All right. Mike, stop groaning. I'm trying to concentrate here. All right, now, I'm sorry. Okay, here we go. The 6th day, we get male and female. That's what's being celebrated on day 6 is male and female. And it comes to us as this crescendo, as the only thing that's created very good. Okay, everything else was good, 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 good. And now God in his image, that makes this even more important to understand, as image bearers of God, he creates this. He creates a male and he creates a female. And that, especially when you're reading it in the Hebrew, becomes the climax of the whole creation story, is that he made them male and female together. So this gives us the basis now for physical marriage. The basis for physical marriage. Now I want to talk about spiritual marriage. The basis for spiritual marriage is found in Genesis 2 and then carried through in the New Testament. So I want you to think about this. With all of those goods and then the very good of the male and the female, the very first not good of entire existence, the very first not good is that the man's alone. So God's gonna create something wonderful for the man. And here's how he does it. He puts the man into a deep sleep where even though Adam is innocent and he has never sinned, his side is wounded. Wounding is supposed to be a result of sin, but Adam is innocent and without sin, yet God wounds his side. And what God takes from that wounded side, he uses to form a bride. And then he wakes the man up in the garden to behold and enjoy his new bride forever and ever. Now, what's the spiritual marriage part? Well, in that exact framework, Jesus comes as a man. And Galatians 4:4 says he came as a man under the law, which means it's also not good for him to be alone. And John the Baptist introduces him to us as a bridegroom, seeking a bride, which we know is the church. How does he obtain his bride, the church? Well, it goes exactly like this. His Father will put him into a deep sleep of death on the cross, where even though Jesus is innocent and he has never sinned, his side is wounded by a Roman spear. And what comes from his side is blood and water. And the Apostle Paul translates that for us. He says, the blood purchases the bride, and the water purifies her from all of her uncleanness. And then Jesus is woken up on the third day in a garden tomb. Remember, Mary thought he was the gardener. And he's to behold his bride forever and ever. That's our spiritual marriage. So if you've noticed my fingers, I have a wedding ring on this hand for my physical marriage, and I have a wedding ring with a cross on it on this hand for my spiritual marriage. And the spiritual marriage, as Jesus says, or Paul says, there's neither male nor female in heaven. So it's a spiritual marriage. So I don't want you guys thinking, I don't want to be no stinking bride. Yes, you do. Now, with the physical marriage and the spiritual marriage, password, okay, no, it's all right. I want to point this out. I want to point out the equality that happens with this, okay? So we have Adam and we have Eve. And there's been a lot of debate over this equality thing. Well, I want you to just consider this theologically. God could have made Eve any way he wanted to. He made Adam of the dirt. And quite frankly, I think the girls are too good for that. He made Adam in the wilderness. There was no garden when Adam was created. He was created in the wilderness. Then a garden was created, and that's where Eve was made, in the garden. And Eve was chosen to be made from the rib of the man. Now think about that bone for a second. Eve was not made from the bone of a man's hand where he would rule over her, or a bone from his foot where he would walk all over her. But God chose a bone from the man's side because she's to be by his side, not behind him and not in front of him, but side by side with him. And it's also the bone closest to the man's heart, which is where a man is to always keep his wife all the days of her life, choosing her above all others till death do them part. Now, that's another picture of spiritual marriage, theologically combined with physical marriage. But I have 3 heroes that I believe are the 3 most impactful and significant world changers that have ever walked this earth. The first one is Jesus of Nazareth, who has clearly done more than probably all of mankind combined with all the good they've done. And he was a single man. It was a single person who is my biggest hero. And I would say, ranked right behind him, as far as impacting the world for good, is the Apostle Paul, another single person. And the one that God has chosen to represent his church for all of history, the very first one to ever know that there was resurrection from the dead and becomes a type of the church, is another single person. It's Mary Magdalene, who is one of the best redemption stories you're ever gonna come across. And it's God had the heart to come to the world as a single person because there is great glory in singleness. And the Apostle Paul actually tells married people, I wish you were as I were as a single person. And Mary Magdalene is not out searching for a husband throughout her life. She's simply wanting to follow Christ, is where she finds her fulfillment. So there's great glory in singleness, there's great glory in marriage, and you're either gonna be single or married. So what does that mean? All of you are positioned in Christ for great glory in your lives.
And I think that's so interesting because I think so many of us, especially in faith cultures, have been told that our sexuality is really only about marriage. And we've seen that our sexuality is part of our bodies, our theology, our spirituality, but our sexuality also we are informed by our sexuality as single people. And we study the word for this, but we can also see it the way God has created us. And Pastor Bill just went through sort of the creation story. But when we look at how God has created our own bodies, this also is the gospel of Christ written into our bodies and written into our sexuality. And so I'm gonna kind of take a little different part of this. And we say a lot of times that our theology is formed through the word of God, but also through the created testimony. And you are each created in God's image. And in that, he created us, again, biologically, with this message of the gospel of sexuality written into our bodies. So it's really cool. First of all, I think we all know that at conception, we become, in those first moments, sexual beings. Because in conception, you receive the chromosomes that are going to inform whether you are male or female. So I am talking about your biological sexuality. And that is for every person. I think they said it's 99.82% of the people receive both of those. There are people that genetically have what we would call a genetic issue with their chromosomes, and that's where we get intersect, but it's 0.18% of the population. But everybody else, God intended to have 2 chromosomes, X and Y, or XX, that determine, again, this duality that we see in the Bible. But it doesn't stop there, because at 7 weeks, the X chromosome starts producing the hormone testosterone. And it changes everything about the body. And that hormone begins to inform us, along with estrogen that also informs us. So we have these hormones that are given to us. Now, along with those hormones, which change everything about you, and then in puberty, change everything about you again, we also have other hormones that actually show us how God intended the covenant of sexuality, the passion of sexuality, to be reflective of his nature. And a couple of those hormones are ones that you've already heard of. If you were on the 10th grade retreat, who remembers the 10th grade retreat? Remember dopamine? Yeah. Dopamine is what we call the do it again hormone. And when you do something that is pleasurable or exciting or something that really gets the excitement centers in your brain going, dopamine tells you to go back and do it again. Well, I promise you, engaging in that passionate sexual activity, even just holding hands, something like that, or kissing, creates dopamine release. Because God wants us to do this again. This is what he's made us for. This is a way that he has shown us that we have passion and pleasure. But the other hormone that we haven't talked about much is oxytocin, and it is just as powerful. And oxytocin is something, again, when you hold hands or you engage, even gazing into someone's eyes, oxytocin is what we call a bonding hormone. And it's produced by your brain, produced in every single one of your brains. Men and women produce it. And when you become desirous of someone, you actually have oxytocin released when you gaze into their eyes or when you have sex with that person, and it bonds you specifically to that person. Not to any person, to the person that you are engaged with, to their face, to their smell, to their bodies. It bonds you to it, or to them. And this is what is crazy, because it creates this covenant that you want to do it again, but you want to do it again with that person. And guys, you can look this up. This is not hidden information. That oxytocin is God's way of saying you are to be committed to one person when you become that intimate and that passionately involved with them. And it's remarkable. And what happens there is that God has written covenant into your bodies. It's one of the reasons why hookup culture is so detrimental. And there's a whole lot of statistics out there about that too. But so even physically, we are created for covenant and for the things that God has written in his word about our sexuality. But there's another part of our sexuality that I'm gonna let Pastor Mike explore with you, because he does it in class all the time.
Yeah, how many of you have I had in family and marriage? Raise your hand real quick. Good. All right, so this will be repeat for you, but you can either amen, give me a thumbs up or thumbs down if this kind of resonated with you in class. And for you juniors, I got a lot of you next semester, and we get to discuss a lot of this in detail in class. But you hear Pastor Schott go all the way back to Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2 and deal with marriage. And in class, we talk about this, where you do the literary history, and I'll defer that to the experts, right? But that is written about 5,000 plus years ago in human history. So this idea of sexuality, of marriage, this whole developed concept is not a new Western Christian idea. It goes back a really long time. And if you follow it all through creation and all through the rest of the Bible, it ends in Revelation. And so you see this idea of marriage and man and woman and the sexual nature of who we are. Start the Bible, end the Bible. It's the single greatest picture throughout all of Scripture. But how many of you like Oreo cookies? Give me a raise of hands here. Oreo cookies. Those of you that do like, what's your favorite part of the Oreo? I'm curious. The center. How many of you are the cookie people? Raise your hand. The outside. Really? Okay, a couple of you. How many of you are the center part, the sweet part? That's where I'm at. Yeah. Okay. So the Bible is very similar to that, right? It starts out with some of the theology. It ends with this marriage of the bride. But right in the middle, in the book of Song of Solomon, right in the middle of the wisdom books, is 8 chapters on human sexuality that is placed there by God. We quote Proverbs a lot in church. We quote Psalms a lot in the church. But right next to that is this book on sex. And if you were to qualify, again, from a literary perspective, what the Song of Solomon would be, it is erotic Hebrew poetry. Now, I'm not a poetry person. I'm gonna be that transparent with you. So when I first read that, I didn't get a lot of it. And then the more you go back and you study this, the more you see both sexual parallels and spiritual parallels with Christ and the church. But there is very specific directions and very specific instruction on what are temptations, what are difficulties, what are the things you're supposed to pursue, things you're supposed to not to pursue, the right timing of all that. And I found that, honestly, as I was growing in my understanding of sexuality and the Bible, the biblical version of it, I found it very, very helpful to me, just the fact that God put that there in the Bible, because I grew up in a culture, like some of you have, where we didn't talk about it, and it was kind of like the hidden thing, and there was this understanding, whether spoken or unspoken, and they addressed it last week, that sex was bad. And then I read Song of Solomon and understood the story behind it, and then understood the imagery behind it, and was kind of like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this book should be like, is this rated X in the middle of the Bible? And it's like, no, it's not rated X, because Miss Quinn started this whole series with this phrase: we should not be ashamed to discuss what God was not ashamed to create. If from week 7, from the very beginning of your life, if you are a sexual creature, would it not make sense that if God made sex fun and pleasurable, and he made it to be repeated, as we heard biologically, that he wouldn't give us instructions, directions, and then creativity and freedom to have fun in that process within certain boundaries? But some of you don't know that because you never read the book of Song of Solomon. You haven't dug into some of that imagery. You haven't challenged your own thoughts of worldly sexuality and balanced it with this idea that, well, maybe God actually does have a plan. And maybe, to be very honest, and I'll say this with my title in front of my name, Pastor Mike, right? Maybe pastors have not done a phenomenal job developing that, but it doesn't mean that God hasn't done a phenomenal job developing that. Maybe the church, maybe those of us that are in leadership haven't done a great job being open and honest and vulnerable, talk about things that maybe we find awkward or we have pain about. But God is not that way because he said, no, this is not wrong. This is not bad. I designed you this way. So again, I would challenge you, we can't go through it now, but for homework, kind of do a study on Song of Solomon. And if you do love the poetry, you look on, you'll go, what are, just for homework, what are the mountains of Bether? I don't understand what that is. You look that up, try to figure out what those things are, and you'll realize it is very, very sexual. But it's also very protective, right? It uses this phrase in Song of Solomon. It says, you should catch yourself the foxes. What is this picture of foxes? Foxes, if you know anything about an agrarian society, would destroy the crops, right? They would take what was supposed to be good, what was supposed to be helpful, what was supposed to be feed you and sustain your life, and they would destroy it. So the author, right, says, you should catch these little things that will destroy your vineyard, and you should make sure you put them away. And you should also not arouse or awaken love, and this is the passionate version of love, until it is the right time. So he gives parameters. He also gives a direction of how we're supposed to manage our sexuality. But the assumption is that you are a sexual creature. It's not weird, it's not wrong, it's not bad, it's not unholy. In fact, it's the exact opposite. It is holy, it is good, it is wonderful. Regardless of whether you get married, as Pastor Schott said, or you don't, your sexuality is a gift. And being a pastor and a high school pastor and a teacher for the last decade and a half or so, like part of what I hear a lot from both men and women, right, that are sitting in your seats, guys and girls, 16, 17, 18, is that I cannot handle my sexuality, so I wish God would just take it away because I don't know how to control it. Let me just say this to you. God is not going to take your sexuality away. I've never heard someone get that prayer answered because what God says is, no, this is a very, very good thing. I'm not going to take it away from you. I am going to help you manage through pain, through failure, through success, through failure. Proverbs says this, right? It says, even though a righteous man or woman falls 7 times, they get back up again. Here's one thing that's really important for you to hear, and you'll hear a little more from Mrs. Mack in a great story. Failure is part of the process. It doesn't make you less of a Christian, less holy than somebody else. Failure is central to redemption. How many of you in this room have failed in any area of your life? Raise your hand, please, so I can make sure I'm not alone in here, all right? We've all have failed, and let me give you this really encouraging thought, right? This is an inspirational quote for the day. You're gonna fail many, many more times in the future, right? Thank you, awesome, wonderful. No, it's a reality. The reason why God gives us direction is so we know where to come back to, not to be a hammer that he beats over our head and tells us we're not worthy. So redemption is central to this. And I want to get to Miss Max. She's got an amazing story that she's going to share about redemption and how that is central to God's heart and this whole biblical narrative.
Hey, guys. So I have 2 things I want to say before I start telling my story. The first thing is that this is my story. I'm not telling this story so that you can kind of aspire to have this same type of story. This is the experience of me and Dr. Mack as we courted and married. And then 2, as I prayed about what God wanted me to share today, and even differently from what was shared on Tuesday, I just have a lot of notes. So if I'm looking back at my notes, it's because I feel like God has laid on my heart some very important things that I think someone in this audience needs to hear. So when I was in high school, I was raised under that purity narrative. You wait until you have marriage or to have sex, and you don't date until you're ready to get married, that type of thing. And so I embraced it as a good Christian girl should, and my friends and I sat down and wrote lists of what our future mate would look like, and I'll be the first to admit my list was very petty. Somewhere on there, I wanted a guy to love God, and I think I wrote that I wanted my future spouse to be 6'1". Obviously, God said no. And I kind of hoped and wished that, my very first boyfriend would be that guy that I spend the rest of my life with. And so part of that journey was not really knowing what sex would look like. I don't think that the adults around me kind of defined that for us, probably out of fear. Similar to what Pastor Mike was saying, the idea that we have all been kind of taught that sex is bad. And so I didn't have those things defined for me. I didn't know what sex or intimacy should or would look like. And so that was a struggle for me. Eventually, I did have a very serious relationship. Don't worry, Dr. Mack knows it wasn't him. And during that relationship, both of us struggled because we didn't know what sex or intimacy should look like. We didn't even know really what love looked like. And so for me especially, I think, I thought sex and intimacy were interchangeable, and they're not. And so in my longing to be close to that guy, I compromised my sexuality because I thought that those two things were interchangeable. And I didn't understand that intimacy is not sex. It is a deep connection with someone other than yourself on a spiritual level. It's something that you develop over time, not just a 5 minutes of pleasure. It's a long-term commitment. And so eventually I did meet Dr. Mack, and immediately after I met him, I did leave that guy for him. And though I was excited about the prospect of being in a godly relationship, I left that first relationship really broken and damaged and confused and guilty. And I brought all of that baggage into my new relationship. And so I actually feel really sorry for Dr. Mack, because he spent a lot of time just really talking to me about the guilt I was experiencing. And he asked me once, he said, "Have you turned away from that sin?" And I remember saying, "Yeah, I do." And he said, "Well, if you've asked the Lord for forgiveness, who am I to hold that over you?" And so, but it wasn't just that conversation that healed me. It was an ongoing search for what and who God has created me to be. And so one of the things I really dealt with was the idea that I had been taught that a good Christian girl waits. And knowing that I did not was difficult for me. And I thought God had turned his eyes from me. And so it was a really hard journey for me, but the Lord is good. He is so good. And the relationship that Dr. Mack and I shared was very different. I mean, obviously he's different. So when I first saw him, he was actually on his knees praying. And I was so drawn to him because of that. I thought, if this man can kneel before the Lord like that, how else will he treat me? And so we talked about early on what our limits were. And he said to me, I think he was the first to say, if I kiss you, that's it. It's over. And I knew that my limits were I had already broken all my limits. And so he proposed that because we knew that kissing was our limit, that we not kiss until our wedding day. And I will be honest, and I didn't tell the 9th and 10th graders this because my daughter was in the room, I was furious. I was like, are you crazy? And he said, no, I think we could do something really cool with this. And so our journey began without the physical aspect, because we knew that would just tear down any prospect of a good, solid, godly relationship. And so we got to know each other on an intimate level with deep conversations about where we saw God leading us, about our ministries later on in life, about our children, things that, many people wait to talk about, we talked about early on. But I want to be clear, that's our story. I'm not telling anyone in here to do the same. If you feel that God is leading you to do that, lovely, lovely. But for us, that's what worked for us. And I think it's something that we share that is very unique to our own relationship. As we went on in our relationship and eventually into our marriage, I realized that intimacy means the idea of transparency. It means the idea of honesty. It means that deep connection that's well beyond what we can do physically at any given time or place. And so Additionally, I realized that sex within the confines of marriage is only 10% the physical. It's 90% the intimacy. And it took me a long time to understand that that is a true thing. And I agree with Pastor Mike, you know, what God has created in all of us, in sex, in our ministries together, is good. He never intended for us not to enjoy that. But I think he wants to protect us from the hurt and the pain, even the baggage that I still carry today. And so when I think about my future with Dr. Mack, I know that because we started out searching for intimacy and not the physical act of sex, I think that our love is so deep and significant. And it changes. Like, I think it's a misconception that people are like, oh, sex is always good in marriage, or you're gonna have sex every day. Those are not true thoughts. Those are not true things. But the idea that it is an evolving thing. It's an evolving, working thing. And I think often as believers, as Christians, we don't talk about that kind of stuff. We kind of leave it to be this abstract thing that should not be touched or discussed. And so my challenge to you is to know that it is hard work to maintain purity. And God has done it not because he hates us, but because he loves us so much. And one thing I want to be clear, and Dr. Mack and I, we were talking about this last night. Often you guys say, well, you guys are old. You guys met in a different time period. There are plenty of Dr. Macks out there, and you know, that's not true. And one thing that I know is that, and we've said this, we probably would not have dated each other in high school. Just, I was struggling in high school, and he was struggling in high school. And so we would not have, been connected in that way. And so I think, looking back at those non-negotiables that you have for yourself and understanding that intimacy is not that physical act, that can wait, because that will leave you so empty. And I know the struggle that I've had. We've been married 19 years this year, and we met 4 years before that. So it's been an ongoing journey. My challenge to you is to ask questions, to seek knowledge, and to know that God has created something good in marriage and relationships, and he does not want us to be hurt. He wants us to embrace that.
Thank you so much for sharing. And we've got to get you out of here and get to class, but I want you to know we are asking you to really think and study and embrace and ask questions about this. God has designed our sexuality to reflect him. He has created it passionate and wonderful. It's written into our bodies, and it is a celebration of the intimacy that we are supposed to share and the relationships that God has called us into. So we're gonna just dismiss you guys right now because you're gonna be late and they're gonna be upset with us. But if you would keep thinking about these things, dwell on these things. We've got 2 more chapels on this, so we're gonna be getting into some other subjects, but we want you to know what God has created sexuality to be. So you are dismissed. Thank you so much.